Hello, welcome to the Sunderland Echoes Raw podcast. I'm your host today, James Copley, joined by my colleague Phil Smith. Phil, how are we doing today?
Still a bit frustrated, I think, from the weekend, like everybody else, I would imagine. Frustrated. I think at least with the opening day of the season, Sunderland played quite well and lost to ultimately an Ipswich team that we expect to be right up there. And the fact that they went and beat Alex Neil Stoke 2-0 at the weekend kind of underlined that. And I don't think Preston were at Ipswich's level. It's not to say they're a bad team, but this loss felt a lot more self-inflicted than the Ipswich one did. So I suppose there's some positives, in what Sunderland are doing for most part of the game. But yeah, Saturday felt like a real opportunity that was passed by. So yeah, a lot of frustration for sure.
Yeah, so that's back-to-back losses in the Championship, both 2-1. First one at home against Ipswich Town at the Stadium of Light. Second one against Preston at Deepdale. Sandwiched in between that as well was a 1-1 draw against Crewe, which goes down as a loss in the Carabao Cup first round because Sunderland lost on penalties. Phil, we were saying during our last and most recent pods that it wasn't time to worry, and it's still very early days in the season, of course, but when should Sunderland fans start getting concerned? Just looking at the sheer statistics from the Preston game, although Sunderland didn't play that well, still 14 shots, only 4 on target. Obviously, there's a story behind those statistics as well, but again, we say on the podcast every week, it seems to be pretty clear where Sunderland's deficiencies lie at the moment.
Yeah, I still think you've got to be, if it was the other way around and Sunderland had got 6 points, but we were saying that but the performance levels were poor, we'd be saying that, and we'd be saying we've got to be really careful that we don't get carried away, and there's still work to do. So it's only right that we go the other way. Now, the first thing I say is Sunderland definitely aren't at top gear. They're not quite at the level they finished last season, but that's probably inevitable. There's been some turnover. There's no Ahmad. It always takes time to gel a little bit and to work up to your best. So if we accept that Sunderland aren't in top gear, the 0 points is not a fair reflection of their two performances, in my opinion. Especially on Saturday, they started quite sluggishly, but were well on top when Preston scored, and ultimately that's another long-range effort that hits the striker. I mean, I think Broadhead half knew what he was doing for his goal. That wasn't the case in this one. It just hits the guy and goes in. Response was really good. Finished the half well. And we're on top again when they gifted up a really poor goal, which is just naive play, really, from young players in the middle of the pitch. So what probably was a bit alarming was that the response to going 2-1 down wasn't brilliant. There was a period where, Roberts draws a fantastic save from Rennie Woodman, Luke O'Neill from the following corner, heads one just wide, probably should hit the target. But it did peter out. And I suppose, is that because confidence has dipped? Is that because there is frustration with the fact that they don't feel, there's that end product there, that player in the box to aim for? Or is it because some players are unsettled? It's impossible to judge that. So the only thing that alarmed me massively, really, beyond the obvious striker thing, which I'm sure we'll come back to, but it's probably not too much point going over and over here because it's the same thing we talked about the last few weeks. I was slightly concerned that there wasn't that real siege, if you like, at the end of the game. But having said that, the two performances, they aren't bad. They're not. Clark was pretty much back to his best on Saturday. Roberts, I thought, was outstanding. So it's definitely not. I'm not just saying it. I genuinely don't think it's a panic situation. But for all, the performances are much better than 0 points. Because of the things we talked about. The strikers, maybe a few teething problems in other areas of the pitch. They have happened for a reason. And they will happen again if those kind of issues aren't addressed. So it's just frustrating, isn't it? Because everybody knows what the issue is. And, every press conference you bring it up, you ask for an update. Fans every day are asking because everybody can see, and we just haven't got there. And with every game that passes Sunderland by, the frustration rises, and it's just natural.
Tony Mowbray decided to drop Hemir, who came in during the summer window from Benfica. He went with Bradley Dack up front, not an out-and-out number 9, you would say. Phil, how did that work against Preston?
It worked okay up to a point, I guess. we asked Mowbray about this afterwards, and he kind of put his hand up and said, it was a tactical decision based on the way the game at Deepdale went a few months ago, and obviously Sunderland won pretty comfortably. He didn't feel there was much point against 3 very kind of traditional centre-halves, putting a young boy up there. He felt it made more sense just to keep the ball off Preston, try and dominate that way. And Sunderland did do that for the most part, but obviously the flip side of that was that they weren't able to flood the box. And so many times they got Robertson Clark to the byline in good positions, but just couldn't quite sort of, Stewart could have had a hat-trick on Saturday. I genuinely don't think that's hyperbole. If you think back to that game against Rotherham last year where he scored twice, little toe pokes, from inside the box, Robertson Clark got in the positions that would have been able to feed him there so many times. So it's a hard one, really. The obvious answer, it didn't work because maybe Hemir would have been able to get on the end of one of those. Although I have to say, he made much of an impression when he came off the bench, which sort of, I guess, added some logic to what Mowbray was saying. I think we've got to be careful with it. Mowbray did, fair enough, took responsibility, said it was a tactical decision on Saturday. We have got to be a bit careful when we talk about Hemir. I understand that when you're lacking strikers, not picking your only striker seems odd, and it is frustrating. But Hemir did not play much football in the second half of last season. Benfica knew that he was going to leave the club, and therefore he wasn't hugely involved. We also put huge demands on the centre forward at Sunderland in terms of the pressing. And I know, Mowbray's repeatedly said through pre-season that while they think they've found someone in Hemir, real talent, it's a huge step up for him in terms of the physical workload, not just in matches, but they're asking him to do every single day in training. So the point there being, he's not going to play 90 minutes every single week at the moment. He's just not. And so therefore Mowbray has to pick and choose a little bit. And like I say, because it was playing against a team 3 at the back, quite a physical side, you probably thought this was a sensible one to go a slightly different way. So yeah, it didn't work because you've lost the game. But I think, I think the logic probably, when Hemir came on, he did struggle to hold it up. Every time the ball went near him, there were 3 centre-halves on him, and he did struggle. So I think you can see why that decision was made. But the one thing I would say, probably similar to Pritchard as well with Dak, he can do the false 9 role. He's clever enough to make a job of it, but he looks to me like he wants someone to bounce off. He wants a striker to occupy the defenders so he can feed off it and feed the striker. We're definitely not going to see the best of Dak in that role. But Mowbray knows that, I'm sure.
You mentioned there, Phil, that Preston are quite a physical side at times. The other sort of selection question I've seen Sunderland fans raise over these 2 championship games certainly is Danny Bart's continued absence, obviously left on the bench against Preston last time out. Luke O'Nine's occupying his shirt at the moment as the left-sided centre-half. Mowbray's stated his reasons several times. Luke O'Nine's captain the side. And I don't think it's necessarily against a slight against Luke O'Nine from the fan base. He's obviously well-respected and well thought of as a player. But the fact remains that Sunderland have lost 2 games in the Championship, conceded 4 goals, and their player of the season from last season is on the bench. And it in the context of those 2 losses, it can seem a bit puzzling on the surface. Yeah,
for sure. I think, for sure. The one thing I would say is that you've got to look at the type of goals Sunderland have conceded if you're going to go down that road. If Sunderland have conceded from crosses into the box or set plays, then I think it's a different question. But the reality is they've conceded from 2 long-range shots that have been deflected. And they've also, in my view, the other 2 goals, George Hurst last week and the second goal here, was because of mistakes in midfield rather than... So, for example, the second goal on Saturday, you give a ball, you have too many players in front of the ball, you give the ball away, and then you've got 4 or 5 Preston players running at 3 Sunderland defenders. Does putting Danny Bart in for Luke O'Nine in that situation prevent the goal? Well, I mean, it's impossible to be definitive, but for me, I'm not convinced that's the case. So I think I can tell you what Mowbray would say in response to that, which is, generally speaking, we're controlling the game. We're not conceding the type of goals where you would obviously say that having Danny Bart in would solve them. And he certainly feels it. And you can see it at times, O'Nine, at times he's getting into the final third when he carries the ball out. He's taking risks, and at times that's going to cost them. But you can see that they're trying to evolve trying to evolve the game. And that's relevant this year because if you listen to Ryan Lowe speak after the game, he talked so much about how they knew about Sunderland's threats, Roberts, Clark. He talked about how sometimes you just have to find a way to win. Sometimes it has to be horrible. And the point I'm making here is that last year, Sunderland caught a lot of teams cold, especially away from home, because they've been promoted out of League One. We're an established championship side. We need to have a right good go at these. And all of a sudden, you leave 30, 40 yards for Roberts, Clark, Ahmad, and they destroyed teams. That ain't going to happen this year. That ain't going to happen this year. Teams are going to sit off Sunderland. Teams are going to be very respectful of the individual talent. And Sunderland need to find ways to break the opposition down in ways that it didn't have to last year. And that's partially behind this move to move 09 into central defence. And the one thing I would say as well is there's obviously a lot going on behind the scenes with Bart in terms of uncertainty over his future. All the way through, Mowbray has said that if Bart stays, there will be games when he plays, right? So potentially when we go away to Millwall, there's a good chance if he's still here, Bart's in the team. So nobody's sort of writing Bart off. Mowbray's just made a decision on where he feels the challenge is different this year and where he thinks something could improve this year. I agree that it seems very harsh on Bart, but I think you also have to be fair and throw it the other way and say, well, would Bart have changed these last two results? Possibly. It's entirely subjective. So someone could say, yes, he would, and you can't prove otherwise. But I feel like at the moment, the issue with the goal Sunderland conceded is what they've done in midfield. I'd be inclined to say, if you to ask me, in terms of these senior players who've dropped out of the team from last year, Pritchard's the one I find harder to understand than Bart, to be honest. It's not a slight on Joe Bellingham, who we've talked about a bit on this pod. We can't believe he's 17, his athleticism, some of the stuff he does on the ball. But I'm struggling to think of a game really in the last couple of years where I think Sunderland have looked loads better without Pritchard than they have with him. I think his pressing, his intelligence, the decisions he makes on the ball. I just think Sunderland are a better team with him in it. And looking ahead, I guess, which is kind of, where we're at now. If I'm talking about making changes to this team, me personally, Pritchard would be higher up my list than probably Bart in for 09. But again, it's subjective, everyone's opinion. But Pritchard's the one for me where I just think, I can't quite get my head around that one at the moment.
Just to throw that forward, Phil, what you've just said about selection to Rotherham on Saturday. Pressure's on that game really at the stadium of you certainly don't want to lose that game. Rotherham, for better or worse, are seen as an inferior team to Sunderland. I think that's fair to say. And in terms of the Bart question and the Pritchard question, do you think Mowbray will stick or do you think he'll twist?
I think he'll definitely stick with 09. I think, part of the reason he's made this change is specifically for home games, to be honest, where last year, I think teams sat off Sunderland, they let the centre-halves have the ball, waited for them to pass into midfield because there was no option to go long, and then it sort of swarmed and oppressed, didn't they? And Stoke was obviously the most high-profile example, but Huddersfield actually did it, if you remember, hugely effectively, and Sunderland were probably pretty lucky to get out of that game with a draw. So I think part of the reason why we've seen this switch to 09 is he feels that 09, whether it's to carrying the ball or playing a briskier pass from the back, can help open teams up at home. So listen, I don't know. Maybe he will think we just need to get a win on the board, whatever. Let's go with some more experience. But I think 09 will stay. I think he's got the captain's armband for a reason. Mowbray was pretty clear last Thursday wanting to go with Mowbray in 09, last Friday, sorry. I think Pritchard surely has to be a different conversation because, and it's not a slight on Bellingham, but Bellingham hadn't arrived at Sunderland with many senior games. So you can't just keep asking him to sort of go and go again. And Mowbray actually, after the first game of the season, said, we're not looking at Bellingham playing 40 games this year. We're looking at him playing 25 to 30. So that tells you that it won't be a big slight if he's not in the team. I think it's an obvious thing where maybe you can get that experience in that way.
Pritchard's definitely capable of dragging Sunderland's attack certainly through a game because we've seen him do it before. I think the game against Coventry at the stadium of last season, the opening fixture, he really helped pull Sunderland through that just with his experience. Yeah,
and I think maybe I suppose the other way is would you bring Hamir in, drop Dak back, and maybe use Pritchard from the bench again, or maybe bring so that it's maybe not as simple as Pritchard. I suppose you could go with Dak in that role as well. And bring Hamir back. I think you probably have to play with a striker on Saturday. yeah, I think you need someone in the box, to be honest. But yeah, so in terms of answering your question, right now, I feel like Pritchard is the more likely one. Obviously, there is Gooch we're expecting to be available, so there is that option to get Gooch in the team, probably instead of Hume, but I suspect he'll stick with Hume for now. But yeah, it's going to be interesting. I don't think he'll make many changes. I really don't. Because if you are being honest, which he definitely is when you say that you think large aspects of the performance are pretty good, then it kind of follows that you can't then panic and make sweeping changes, right? So I think we will potentially see something similar. The obvious potential change maybe you can maybe use Job from the bench. And obviously you have a decision to make up front as well.
And how are you finding Mowbray at the moment, Phil? Just from the limited time that you get to spend with him, maybe after the match, after these losses, just from the outside looking in, from the videos I've seen, he doesn't seem to be cutting the figure of somebody who is panicking yet either. He seems to be very, very level-headed about everything, as you would expect, and as you've alluded to, Sunderland have the provided moments and the provided spells in games where the performances have been okay.
Yeah, I think so. Really, really difficult position for him to be in at the moment. In terms of, everybody knows the issue is the striker, and Mowbray is entitled to stand there and say that, but he also knows that if he says it too much, it becomes a story. But obviously, he doesn't want to sort of try and pull the wool over fans' eyes either, so he's got to address it. So I think that when we analyse sort of press conferences, body language, all that kind of stuff, you've got to also be fair to Mowbray and say that he's starting off from a position where he knows there's a lot of scrutiny on what he says.
And it's tough for him because he's not the one bringing the striker in either, is he? So he has to answer these questions on strikers, and it's a tough position. You're right in what you say there.
Yeah, listen, I think generally, I think there's an argument that sporting directors should take off some of the pressure off their head coaches during transfer windows, because it's really interesting. Obviously, on the continent, you see in Germany and Italy, and the sporting directors tend to be a lot more proactive in terms of speaking to the media. Some of them do it in mix zones at the end of games. Now, I don't think that's particularly healthy, by the way. And it's not particularly a knock on Christian Speakman, because Christian Speakman does tend to speak to the media semi-regularly. Yeah. Certainly he does it before and after windows, which I think is fine. And it will answer questions and give good insight on stuff. We know as well that he always puts explanations in club statements and little stuff like that, which you can take for granted because it doesn't necessarily happen at other clubs, and certainly hasn't happened in the past at Sunderland. But the point I'm making is that, it's a difficult position for a head coach to be in, where they're not actually in charge of that process. And they know that there's potentially a lot of sensitivity around what they say on it. And so the reason why I raise that, if people are looking at Mowbray saying the body language isn't quite right or what have you, then I think the one thing I would put out there as well is that, he obviously is trying to tread very, very carefully in that scenario. I think he is okay, yeah. Like I say, I think he feels like the team isn't a million miles off, but it needs those extra ingredients. And how often do you knock on the door? How often do you come out and press and say, we need it now, before it loses its impact, really? So I think he's just navigating that situation. I think everyone can see that it's a little bit unsettled at the moment. The transfer window's still open. The speculation over certain players, the squad isn't complete. Has the uncertainty in the speculation from the end of last season ever been 110% resolved? Probably not. And, before, that's not to say that, there's a major issue or anything, but I think there is a bit of uncertainty that's lingered from last year.
Is it possible? Do you remember when we spoke about sorry to interrupt, but the club missed a couple of good opportunities to just put it to bed straight away? I think so. We said, absolutely, Sunderland do not have to comment on every little rumour that goes around, because if they did, they'd probably get nothing done. Completely fair enough. But that in the summer did seem to gather legs pretty quickly. You had, respected journalist Fabrizio Romano tweeting about it, and it was a hot topic of conversation. And yes, it petered out, but the club never really sort of put it to bed.
Not really. And I do think that's left a little bit of a... and again, I hope this doesn't come across too sort of dramatic, because it's really not meant to be. I think it's just left something a little bit in the air, I think. And I
You're
think
dealing
when you
with human
couple,
beings at the end of the day.
yeah, I think so. And I think when you couple that with the uncertainty over some of the players, which, as we've discussed before, isn't necessarily the club's fault. It's just the nature of the business. Yeah, I think I've seen a lot of people say something isn't quite right. And I kind of get that without being overly dramatic about it. I think it is just a consequence of uncertainty. If you look at the second half of last year, the way that group came together really strongly, seemed to really bond, had so much energy and fight in every single game pretty much. I think it is quite hard at the moment for Sunderland to achieve that. And we're always guilty of being in the Sunderland bubble, so we only ever see it through the Sunderland prism. I know for a fact that there are so many clubs up and down the country who are in a similar position,
Yeah.
So, as we said it again, we said it last week, we'll say it again, shut the transfer window before the season starts. It's unfair on everybody. So, yeah, I can't remember exactly what question we started off with here, but yeah, there's definitely, I think, we're not burying our heads in the sand. It's not there at the moment, 100%. It is definitely not. And yet, I think you have to be sort of respectful of the fact that they've not turned in two shocking performances. It's just not the case. But Saturday, it was poor to lose that game because they shouldn't have done. So let's have that right as well. And that was why my main emotion coming away with that game was frustration. Because it was just a result that shouldn't have happened.
It's interesting what you say about being in a Sunderland bubble, and we look at Tony Mowbray having to answer questions on transfers that he might not know too much about, and he's not necessarily making the decisions on those transfers. I listened to Jurgen Klopp and Mauricio Pochettino after Liverpool's draw with Chelsea, and they were both asked about Moses Caicedo from Brighton, and they both said, I don't know. So Mowbray is not unique in that position. It's a sort of a symptom of modern football at the moment. He did, though, however, Phil, have a sort of a transfer priority that he's outlined, which isn't a striker. Talk us through that.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably the other one that fans have been talking about ever since Corey Evans' ACL, isn't it? In terms of that midfield, that experience.
Number 6.
Now, Sunderland did have a look about in January, but ultimately made the decision that we've got Mishu and Ekwe, and we need to play them. And full credit to Dan Neil, who took on Evans' role and did it excellently. And then after a little bit of time, Mishu and Ekwe came on really strong at the end of the season. So while I would still have tried to get a bit more experience, and I think you have to say that decision worked out okay in the end. Particularly in moving Ekwe from someone who'd not played much senior football to being a bang-on starter by the end of the year. The situation's a little bit different this time around, isn't it? Because if Matete is injured, yes, you want to give Ekwe and Neil loads of opportunities. You want to give Chris Rigg the odd opportunity. But you're one injury away from being incredibly light. And so I still think that could be a sensible way of adding depth to the squad and also adding a little bit of experience to the squad without massively detracting from the game time for your really experienced young players. But Mowbray could not have been much clearer. We'll try and get the strikers sorted out first. So it's definitely strikers first, and then we'll take a breath, I think, and see what's out there. But that's going to be a really interesting one to follow in the closing weeks of the season, closing weeks of the window, sorry. I do think it's something that they really do need to look at, and it sounds like they are aware of that. But how that comes to fruition, we'll have to wait and see.
Indeed, it does appear like there are transfer irons in the fire, so to speak, Phil. There's Abline, who's been linked, the French attacker. There's the lad from Ukraine as well. The right back from PSG, Dogba, I think it's called. So it does appear that Sunderland are active. We know that they're definitely active in the transfer market. How close do you think we are to a breakthrough, or is it just one of those where it's pretty difficult to tell at the moment?
I think it's really difficult to tell at the moment, honestly. I think we have an idea of the shape of what we expect Sunderland to do. Mowbray spoke a little about 10 days ago, I think, about certainly in those attacking positions. We know that Sunderland want to make another permanent addition. They would ideally like to do that because it makes them in a much stronger position when we move forward with a Ross Stewart situation, if they have one through the building. I think Mowbray has been pretty clear that and I think it's fairly obvious from what's happened in the market that these established Championship / Premier League strikers, however you want to describe it, are probably out of someone's range financially at the moment. So we know that they're probably looking abroad for an addition. Some of those names that you've mentioned, I assume, come into that. We also know that they do want someone with a little bit of experience. It's not going to be a 33-year-old on a big transfer fee, but we know that because of obviously Jame's experience, and when he's fit, Elias Miende's experience, they want someone who's a little bit more established. So that, I think, is the kind of the priority. Obviously, those deals can be hard to do when there's fees involved and what have you. I would be amazed if not necessarily an out-and-out striker, but an attacker of some sort, if Sunderland don't use the loan market, because we saw with Ahmad that there's a huge amount of quality there. But the loan market, so much of it doesn't move until the very end of the window. And that's the reality. And as frustrating as it is, it's not all about Sunderland. Sometimes you do have to show a little bit of patience, but it is a very, very fine line, because there's obviously big games between now and that window shutting. So it's an anxious time, I think, for everyone, isn't it? There is a lot of anxiety. Hopefully the breakthrough is this week, but sitting here now, I don't think there's necessarily any guarantee of that.
Yeah, and Rotherham on Saturday, Phil, is it too early to be calling that a must-win? But it sort of feels that way. I mean, I don't think, certainly not suggesting that Mowbray's job, hangs on that, because I don't think it does at all. But 3 losses or even 2 losses and a draw would be hard to justify, I think.
Yeah, I think it's again, we'll judge Saturday on Saturday's performance. I think, if Sunderland are playing incredibly well, but they get a red card that's never a red card, and then a deflected goal goes in, then, you have to recognise that. But I think it is a really important game, because there's 2 tough games before the international break after that. It's Coventry and Southampton, I think, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so if you don't get a positive result from this game, then you are potentially going into 2 huge games before the international window without a win. And then, you can quickly get into a fairly backs to the wall scenario. That's not been over dramatic. And maybe that is wrong, but it is the reality of football. So it is a really, really important game. I think if you go and produce another decent performance and get over the line, then I also think that allows you to be the retrospect on the first 2 games changes, because then you've had 3 decent performances and hopefully your luck's starting to turn. I think, you want to keep that feel-good factor from last year. It was a really powerful thing towards the end of last year.
Brilliant.
And it's really important that it isn't allowed to evaporate. So, it is really important that someone get on the front foot and get 3 points on the board. And I do think, you'll get a lot of belief from that.
There's a bit of symmetry there as well.
Ringing.
There's a bit of symmetry there as well, isn't there, Phil? Because if you cast your minds back, it was Rotherham at home was Mowbray's first game, and they got off on a brilliant footing. Mowbray's tenure got off on a brilliant footing. He was brilliant in the press conference afterwards. The feel-good factor sort of built from there. Yes, there were a few dips along the road. Around Christmas time, those two draws at the Stadium of Light against Preston and Blackpool, and they did go through lulls, but that Rotherham game really helped propel Sunderland. I felt it was sort of all right, okay, Alex Neil has left, but all is not lost here. And we could do with that again. We really could do with that again under Tony Mowbray.
Yeah, I think that game is so interesting as well, because if you look at the goals, Sunderland were really good that night, but Stewart scored a couple of tap-ins. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, I mean it in a complimentary way. He got in the right position and scored them. And then Jack Clark scored an absolute world, didn't he, where he picked up the ball and just ran and smashed it in the bottom corner. And actually, Mowbray has talked about that game loads since he got here, specifically for Ross Stewart being stood in the 6-yard box, kicking the ball in the net. Yeah. And he goes back to it all the time. And Saturday was the perfect example. How many times did someone get the byline and it's just not quite there? So, it's funny that you reference that, because Mowbray references it an awful lot, because, obviously he loves Stewart because he does everything, doesn't he? He's absolutely brilliant. Who wouldn't? But specifically because he was stood next to the goal and he kicked the ball in the net.
It's that simple sometimes, isn't it?
Wouldn't it just be great if he was back to do that, So, listen, I think it's a big game. It really is a big game. And I think that we should go into it feeling, with a bit of positivity and a bit of confidence, because if Sunderland replicate much of what they did in the first 2 games, then they've got a really good chance. But, you know, we'll keep doing these podcasts, and unless it gets rectified, we'll keep talking about the fact that Sunderland lack cutting edge and a bit of presence in the penalty box. It is frustrating for us to be sat talking about it again, but that's just the reality. And hopefully this is the last time we have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. We've definitely gone over old ground, but what can you do, Phil? Times are tough.
No, it's as relevant as it was, you know, last week and the week before that. It absolutely is.
Definitely. Well, Sunderland face Rotherham United at the Stadium of Light on Saturday. You can follow all of the build-up and match day coverage over on the Sunderland Echo website. You can listen to this podcast on all podcast platforms, Facebook and Twitter as well. And the radio now, check out the Cat radio station. And once again, thank you very much for listening.